Now, I mentioned before that most of the Kentucky settlers who hadn't been killed were forced to flee back east for protection. Now, Kentucky was on the brink of annihilation. They were in desperate need of repopulation. A lot of those settlers who had been forced to flee back east had reconvened at Fort Pitt. And in addition to those who had fled Kentucky, there was also a new group of settlers that were willing to go down and repopulate Kentucky, and Kentucky was in desperate need of that. However, the journey wasn't safe unescorted. They needed a military escort, and George Rogers Clark's Illinois Regiment was going to be that escort. So in the spring, when the four companies convened at the Redstone settlement, that was the first time that we were all together, and that was the first time that we realized how few our numbers were. Remember, we were supposed to have 350 that was authorized. We had 150. So again, we were a regiment in name only. Nonetheless, Clark decided to continue the campaign. So we got in a series of boats, pirogues and river boats and canoes, and with the settlers in tow, we started from Fort Pitt down the Ohio River. And we came all the way down the Ohio River without much event until we reached the Falls of the Ohio here. Now, the Falls of the Ohio no longer exist. They were eliminated in order to allow for modern river navigation, but in my time, it was a long, relatively low in terms of elevation waterfall. Right at the Falls of the Ohio, there was an island that was in the river, much closer to the south bank of the Ohio River than the north bank, and it was called Corn Island. And it was there that George Rogers Clark decided that he was going to set up a temporary camp. He said that he set the camp up on Corn Island in order to make it more defensible. In case any hostile Indian tribes found out that we were in the area and tried to attack us, it would be easier for us to defend ourselves. But that was not the real reason why he chose Corn Island. The real reason was Corn Island was the location where he decided he was going to reveal the true nature of the campaign, which was the private orders. Remember, up until that time, the regiment had been recruited thinking that we were going to go into Indian country and directly fight Indians. At Corn Island, he informed the regiment that that was not our intent. We also, by the way, were met at the Falls of the Ohio by some Kentucky militia. Now, they didn't have much that they could spare, but whatever they could spare, they sent to meet Clark's regiment here at the Falls of the Ohio. Clark set up sentries around the island to make sure that nobody could escape. And at that time, he revealed what the private orders were. And the private orders were that we were not going into Indian country. Instead, we were going into the Illinois country, and we were going to take control of the outpost by which the British had been paying the Indians to raid Kentucky. Now, as you can imagine, the men who had signed up under the terms of the public orders were not very happy with that at all. But they also had a problem on their hands, and that was that the only way to get back home was to go upstream against the Ohio River, and Colonel Clark was in control of the boats. So they could not like it, but there wasn't much that they could do about it. The Kentucky militia, on the other hand, was in a completely different situation. They were in their backyard, and they came over land. They didn't need boats to get home, and they knew the way home. So that evening, a lieutenant from the Kentucky militia started conspiring with other members of the militia to escape and flee back to their settlements. They found a gap in the sentries that Clark had posted around Corn Island, and they were in fact able to get across the river, make it to the south bank of the Ohio, which wasn't very far distance at all, and the water there wasn't very deep at all. And they headed back to their settlements. Now, upon finding out that this desertion had happened, Clark immediately set out a force to try and chase them down and bring them back. And we were only successful in capturing a couple of them. Most of them made it back to their settlements and to their eternal shame and disgrace. Because as it turned out, when the people that lived in their settlements found out that they had deserted, these men were pariah. And on the other hand, if they had stayed with the regiment, as it turns out, not a single one of them would have been lost. But I'll tell more about that later. Clark now has a problem on his hand, and that is that desertion is catching. And once one group finds out that you can desert and not pay any penalty for it, Clark was afraid that it was going to spread throughout the camp. So that shortened the time in which we were going to finish the rest of the campaign. Rather than waiting and doing the additional training that he had hoped to do on Corn Island, he knew that we needed to put in the water now. So he called a council with his officers, and we decided that that was going to be the plan, and we told the rest of the soldiers, because again, we didn't want them to think that there had been a successful desertion. We told them that the Kentucky militia was sent home because upon talking about it, we decided that we didn't really need them. They were more needed and more valuable defending their settlements, that we had plenty of men to do the job at hand, which was a complete lie, and we sent them home. And then we immediately took the troops that we had remaining and prepared to get back in the water. Now, Clark had left instructions for the civilians. From this point on, no more civilians came with us for the remainder of the campaign. All the civilians that had come down the Ohio with us from Fort Pitt remained at the falls. And Clark left instructions for them that after we departed, they were to move the settlement from the island onto the mainland on the south bank of the Ohio River. And they did that and formed the town of Louisville, Kentucky. And Louisville took its name from King Louis. And by the way, before Clark departed on this campaign, he was aware of the Treaty of Alliance between the United Colonies and France. And that would prove to be very beneficial later on when we encountered the French townspeople in the river valleys. So anyways, Louisville was named in honor of King Louis with his Treaty of Alliance with America. And George Rogers Clark is known as the father of Louisville because it was he who gave the orders for those remaining civilians to move ashore on the south bank and form that town. So they went to Louisville and set up that settlement, and the rest of us got back in the river and shot the falls of the Ohio. Now, a significant event happened the day that we shot the falls of the Ohio. And just recently here, back in the spring of 2024, you encountered a total solar eclipse. The very first total solar eclipse that was ever recorded in North American history, meaning when there were white Europeans there to record it. Of course, they'd been happening since time immemorial, but as far as recorded history, the first total solar eclipse happened on June 24th, 1778, at the precise time that we were shooting the falls of the Ohio. Now, many of the men thought it was an omen. They were very superstitious about it. They were divided onto whether it was a good omen or a bad omen, but they all knew that it was an omen of some kind. So we shot the falls of the Ohio, and we continued to make our way downriver until we got very close to Fort Massac. Now, Fort Massac was the last French fort that was ever built in North America. They completed it just in time to lose the French and Indian War. So when they built it, it had a very strategic location here. It was on the north bank of the Ohio River, in between the Wabash and the Mississippi. When they built it, everything to the downriver to the west of it was French. Everything upriver to the east of it was enemy territory. That was the British. So having that fort there to control access to the Mississippi River, where the Ohio flows into the Mississippi, was very strategic. However, once the French lose the French and Indian War, and they now have to cede possession of it to the British, it no longer has any strategic value to the British, because now, no matter which direction you go, east or west, upriver or downriver from Fort Massac, it's now friendly territory. So the British never garrison the fort. They take control of it and immediately let it fall into ruin because it serves no purpose for them. Now, the interesting thing about Fort Massac is when the French were in control of this area, they built military roads to connect all these forts and settlements. So there was a road that connected Fort Massac to Kaskaskia, just as there was a road that connected Kaskaskia to Cahokia. Once Fort Massac was abandoned, which again was as soon as it had been completed, once Fort Massac was abandoned, that road that connected Fort Massac to Kaskaskia no longer made any sense. It was literally the road to nowhere. It took a lot of effort to maintain a road. Remember before when I was talking about how you blaze trails? Well, with vegetation completely growing up, you had to continually maintain a road in order to make it visible. And once Fort Massac was abandoned, the road from Mass to Kaskaskia was left to become overgrown and fall by the wayside just as Fort Massac had. Now Clark knew this because 1 year prior to this campaign being approved by Governor Henry and his counselors, Clark had planted spies in these Mississippi River towns, and he knew that the French were expecting an attack from the Americans. And when I say the French, by the way, I mentioned that the French were allowed to maintain their settlements here as long as they signed an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. Having done that, the British did not maintain a presence here. What they did is they put local French people in charge of these settlements. So for instance, there was a man named Mr. Rocheblave who was put in charge of Kaskaskia. So they were expecting an American attack, but they thought the way it had to come was by coming down the Ohio River to the Mississippi and then poling their way against the current upriver against the Mississippi to attack Kaskaskia. And by the way, too, Kaskaskia at that time was in between the Mississippi River and the Kaskaskia. I'm sorry, it was not in between. It was on the eastern bank of the Kaskaskia River. Oh no, I'm sorry, I said that wrong again. It was in between the Mississippi River and the Kaskaskia River. The Mississippi River, much later after this, during an earthquake, jumped its channel and started flowing into the channel that was formerly the Kaskaskia River. So whereas Kaskaskia used to be west of the Kaskaskia River and east of the Mississippi, it is now on the west side of the Mississippi River. It's one of the few parts of modern-day Illinois that is on the west side of the Mississippi River, and the only way to get to it is to cross into Missouri. You have to get to Kaskaskia from Missouri. It no longer has a land connection to Illinois. So they thought that that's where the attack had to come. It had to come upriver, up the Mississippi until they reached the Kaskaskia River, and then up the Kaskaskia River. So Clark, knowing that they were expecting this and that they had lookouts all down the Mississippi River and at the mouth of the Ohio looking for this, he knew that the way to attack, and remember again, for this to be successful, it had to be done with utter secrecy and surprise. He knew that the way to attack Kaskaskia was by taking the old abandoned French military road, and from the spies that he had in country, he also knew that road was not only no longer maintained, but it was also unguarded. So that would give us the opportunity to sneak up on Kaskaskia. So we continued down the river until we got to the mouth of the Tennessee River. This was 3 leagues above Fort Massac. And there we encountered a party of long hunters. And now that was a problem because we had no idea who these long hunters were. There was no way to tell by the way they were dressed what nationality they were. We didn't know if they were French. We didn't know if they were British. We didn't know if they were American. And if they were American, we didn't know if they were patriot or loyalist. So we pulled them down and we started questioning them there at a little island right at the mouth of the Tennessee River. And it turned out that they not only were American, but were sympathetic to the patriot cause. And to our great good fortune, not only were they Americans, but they had just come from Kaskaskia. And they were willing to serve as our guides to take us to Kaskaskia, because remember, this road was no longer maintained. So in some places, especially on the meadow, it was non-existent, and it was very easy to get lost. So we were now operating not on intelligence that was a year old, we were now operating on intelligence that was only a week old, and they were serving as our guides. So we got back into the river, went the short distance down to Fort Massac, got out of the water at Fort Massac, and made camp there on the night of the 27th of June. The very next morning we left, and we started out for Kaskaskia. The trip was very uneventful. The only problem was during the time when we were in the meadow, when there were no trees and it was very easy for the road to get overgrown, our guides got lost, and for a time Colonel Clark thought that they were maybe trying to lead us into an ambush, that they weren't really patriots after all. But it turns out they were just lost because the road wasn't marked very well, and Colonel Clark threatened to execute them if they didn't figure out where they were very quickly. And they scouted up ahead a little bit, and they were able to get their bearings and get back on track. and they took us to the outskirts of Kaskaskia. We arrived there at Diamond Cross on the evening of none other than the 4th of July, 1778. We then crossed the Kaskaskia River north of the town and proceeded to move south until we surrounded the town. Now by this time it was evening, so it was dark. Nobody had any idea that we were coming. We were able to completely surround and secure the town, and we put out orders that no one was to leave their houses under pain of death. We didn't know whether they were going to be friendly or hostile, so to be safe, Colonel Clark ordered everyone to remain in their house, and we also took as a captive Mr. Rocheblave, who was in charge of Kaskaskia. Now the local Kaskaskians were terrified of us. By the time we had actually made it all the way there to the Mississippi River, we were nearly naked. Our clothes were threadbare, and in Colonel Clark's own words, we bore a very savage appearance. The French had also been told by the British that the big knives, or the long knives as they called us, were barbaric, and that we would torture them and put them to death if we were ever to take possession of their towns. And the appearance that we gave when we arrived there gave proof to that. We very much looked the part. A modern example of this, a somewhat modern example, is back in what you call the Second World War, for the American involvement in 1941 to 1945. We had captured an island named Saipan, and the locals there had been told by the Japanese of the savage barbarity of the United States Marines and how they would be treated if they would ever be captured. So as the island was falling, these civilians took themselves to a cliff, and with them and their children, they started throwing themselves off the cliff to kill themselves so they didn't have to suffer through the torture of the American Marines. The way that the local French townspeople viewed us was not dissimilar. They were terrified of us, and Clark played on that terror in order to make sure that there would be no resistance to us taking over the town. Now, I mentioned before that these towns were all culturally French, and that meant that they were also Catholic. Now, once they had come under British dominion, they were no longer allowed to practice their Catholic religion, because by this point in British history, British was Anglican, and they were very, very hostile to the Catholic Church. So these people had not been allowed to openly practice their religion, but yet they had a priest who had a very large circuit that he used to travel. His name was Father Pierre Gibault, and he served all of these French towns in this region, going all the way up as far as Fort Michilimackinac here in the very northern part of the lower portion of your modern-day Michigan. So Father Gibault happened to be in Kaskaskia at the time that we took possession of it. And the local townspeople were terrified that the men were going to be killed and the women and children were going to be sold off into slavery. And they wanted to be able to have one last mass in their church so that they could say their goodbyes to one another. And they asked Father Gibault to be their representative to plead for mercy before Colonel Clark and allow them to celebrate one last mass in their church before we did what we were going to do to them. And it was at that time that Colonel Clark realized that he had these local French people exactly where he wanted them. And now was the time to tell them the truth of what their fate was going to be. So he looked at Father Gibault and he said, "What do you need my permission for? You're free. You can do whatever you want. We're not your conquerors, we're your liberators. I never told you you couldn't travel freely and have mass in your church." Now, of course, he had done exactly that. He initially told everyone that if they were to remain in their houses and if they turned out on the streets, they would be put to death. But now he tells them that they don't have to worry about that, that they're free, they're liberated, and they can celebrate their mass in their church, and they have nothing to fear from the Americans. He also now, remember I mentioned before that he knew of the Treaty of Alliance between King Louis XVI and the American Congress. And it's at this time that he makes these French people aware of that treaty. Now remember, these French people had to renounce their allegiance to France and sign an oath of allegiance to Great Britain in order to remain in their towns. But that was a half-hearted measure. They only did that because it was a requirement of being able to stay in their settlements. In their hearts, they were still French. And once we had eliminated the British threat and informed them of the alliance between France and America, they were very, very eager to join our cause. And Virginia had also authorized us to administer the oath of citizenship to Virginia to any that cared to do so. Now, there was no American national identity at that time, so we weren't empowered to make them American citizens. We were only empowered to make them citizens of Virginia, and we did that. Almost all of the local French townspeople were very, very eager to join the American cause, with the exception of Mr. Rocheblave. He remained very hostile to us until the end. But the rest of the townspeople were very, very sympathetic to our cause and eagerly took the oath of citizenship to Virginia and joined us. They also found out that our plans were not just to take Kaskaskia, but also to go north and take Cahokia, as well as Vincennes. And upon discovering that plan, they told us, you don't need to worry about resistance there. We all know each other. We're related, we're friends, we do business together, and we'll go with you and tell them that they should offer no resistance and should join the American cause, and you'll be able to take those towns without a shot being fired. And by the way, when we took Kaskaskia, we did that because it was such a surprise. We did that without a shot being fired or a life being lost on either side. And now these French townspeople are telling us that if we take them with us, they can assure us the same thing will happen in Cahokia and Vincennes. And so we do exactly that. We take the local, some of the local leading officials of Kaskaskia and take them up to Cahokia. In fact, it was my company, Joseph Bowman's company, that was detached to go up to Cahokia and secure it. And then we do the same thing to Vincennes. Now, Cahokia was very, very important for two reasons. One is it is directly across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. Now, St. Louis at that time was a Spanish possession. The Louisiana Territory used to vacillate back and forth between being under Spanish or French dominion. At this particular time, it was under Spanish dominion. And St. Louis was the capital of Spanish Louisiana. Now, the governor there was a man named Francisco de Leyva. And Patrick Henry, when he authorized the expedition, had made contact with Governor de Leyva and told him that I have an expedition that's coming out to the Mississippi River, and in the event that they make it there, they're going to be in bad need of resupply. Would you be so kind as to provide them the supplies they need, and we will reimburse you from the Virginia Treasury? And de Leyva agrees to do that. So since Cahokia is right across the river at St. Louis, we immediately reach out to Governor de Leyva, make liaison with him, and true to his word, he provided us with an unbelievable quantity of goods that we needed to re-equip our regiment. He provided us with yards and yards and yards of blue and white wool that we used to make uniforms out of. They provided us with shirts, shoes, buckles, buttons, hats, muskets, cartridge boxes, bayonets, everything you could possibly think of. And even though we were so far away from our closest American base of supply, which was Fort Pitt's here, and we're all the way over here at the Mississippi River at Cahokia and Kaskaskia, we ended up being one of the best equipped and supplied American regiments in the entire Revolution because of what the Spanish had provided to us. Now, the other reason Cahokia was important is Cahokia, for long standing, had been a very important cultural and trade center of the Indians in the region. And remember, the main reason for this campaign was in order to reduce the Indian raids into Kentucky. So Colonel Clark did this. He called a council of the various Indian nations in the region that had been raiding Kentucky, and he invited them to come to Cahokia so that we could treat with them. Now, Clark had always thought that there were two ways to deal with the Indians, the British way and the French way, and he thought the French way was superior. The British way was to treat the Indians like infants, like children, that they were not intelligent and their loyalty had to be bought off. The French way was to treat them as equals, and Clark always thought that that was the better way. So when he called these Indians together at Cahokia, he started explaining to them the nature of the reason we were fighting the British. And he didn't do it in childlike terms. He told them exactly why we were fighting the British. He talked about the nature of settlement here in North America. He talked about the encroaching tyranny that the British Crown was using against Americans. He talked about the rights of man. And this appealed to the Indians. They said at the time that they realized that they had been lied to by the British, that they had only heard their side of the story. And upon hearing the American side of the story and what the reason was for our revolution, they realized that we were in the right. Most of them realized that we were in the right. And they offered to switch sides. Many of them right there on the spot said that they would fight no more, that they would lay down the tomahawk and not fight on behalf of the British in Kentucky anymore. Some of them wanted to switch sides and fight for us. And Clark wouldn't allow that to happen. And that was out of sheer morality. He told the Indians that this is our fight against the British, it's not your fight. And all we want from you is that you sit out the war and stop raiding Kentucky.